I had been watching this deer for nearly 15 minutes in the slowly brightening light of a beautiful, cool Texas fall morning. I could finally see well enough to determine that I was looking at a legal buck. Slowly, I prepared my rifle, turned on the fire dot reticle in my scope, took aim, and removed the safety. I placed that glowing red dot right on the buck's shoulder, waited a few seconds for him to turn slightly, and then squeezed the trigger. My scope barely jumped from the shot, and the deer never left my reticle. The thump noise of that bullet impacting the deer echoed across the woods as the buck instantly collapsed, never to get up again. Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 396 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. In this episode, I conduct a deep dive on the 6.5 Creedmoor and the much newer 22 Creedmoor, informed by real-world data I have obtained at the range, in ballistic gel, and afield for both cartridges. Of all the Creedmoors, there is the largest gap in performance between the 22 and the 6.5. That shouldn't be surprising, though, because those are the smallest and the largest Creedmoor cartridges, respectively. So in this episode, we'll discuss the overall design characteristics and performance specs of each one. Then we'll compare how they stack up next to each other. I'll also discuss how they have each performed for me afield and in ballistic gel. And yes, I will discuss the full story of that hunt I just teased you with to include the details on what cartridge I used for that deer hunt. Before we get started, make sure you are on my email list. And if you like the podcast, you will love the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. Sign up at the link in the show notes or at biggamehuntingpodcast.com/ebook. Now let's get started talking about the 22 and the 6.5 Creedmoor. We'll talk about the history and design characteristics of these two rounds briefly. We'll start with the 6.5 Creedmoor. Now, the 6.5 Creedmoor is a short-action rifle cartridge Dave Emery of Hornady Manufacturing built to meet the criteria specified by Creedmoor Sports General Manager Dennis DeMille. The story of the 6.5 Creedmoor begins at the 2005 national matches at Camp Perry. He was using a different cartridge at the competition that year, and essentially he had to load it too hot to get the performance he wanted, and so he was having all the normal excess pressure signs, stiff bolt lift, pierce primers, things like that. So he told Emery that what he would really like was an off-the-shelf, short-action rifle cartridge that was accurate enough to win competitions like the national matches at Camp Perry, that also checked a couple of other boxes. Specifically, he wanted this new cartridge to have less wind drift, a flatter trajectory, and less recoil than the .308 Winchester, while at the same time also having a similar rapid-fire barrel life to the .308. So Emery and Hornady designer Joe Thielen sat down, did some brainstorming, and came up with the idea to use a modified 30 Thompson center case they necked down to shoot 6.5 millimeter or .264 caliber bullets for this new cartridge project. Now, the 30 Thompson center is not a very well-known or widely used cartridge, and to be quite frank with you, it was a flop commercially. Now, check out episode 286, where I talk about all the different 30 caliber cartridges to learn more about the 30 Thompson Center. But long story short, it is not exactly the same as the .308 Winchester, but the 30 Thompson Center uses a similar case that is slightly shorter than the .308 Winchester case. It also has less taper and uses a steeper 30-degree shoulder. Now, that shorter case length made the 30 Thompson Center the perfect platform to use for the new 6.5 millimeter cartridge Emery and Thielen were building. This is because it would allow them to build a cartridge with more head height. Head height is the amount of space available for the bullet outside the case while staying within SAAMI specifications for a cartridge. Put simply, more head height facilitates the use of very long aerodynamic bullets without requiring them to be seated so deeply into the case they protrude into the powder column. This meant the new 6.5 millimeter cartridge they were building, that was based on the relatively short 30TC case, could better accommodate long, heavy, high ballistic coefficient bullets than if they would have simply necked down a .308 Winchester case to 6.5 millimeter like Remington did with the 260 Remington. Now, Emery and Thielen gave their new cartridge a fast 1 and 8-inch rifling twist rate to properly stabilize those bullets. They named it the 6.5 Creedmoor in honor of the Creedmoor matches and Dennis DeMille's company, Creedmoor Sports, and then they released it to the world in 2008. A typical 6.5 Creedmoor load shoots a 140-grain bullet at about 2,700 feet per second. That might not seem that impressive, but that cartridge uses high BC bullets that retain energy and resist wind drift exceptionally well. And yes, the 6.5 Creedmoor does outperform the 308 in those areas. Check out my episode comparing those two cartridges for details. In addition to all of that, Emery and Thielen also incorporated many of the so-called modern cartridge design principles Outdoor Life shooting editor John Snow and I discussed in episode 366 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Taken together, all of those cartridge design principles improve the overall accuracy potential of a cartridge, like the 6.5 Creedmoor in this case, which has a reputation for outstanding accuracy in factory rifles and with factory ammo. For all of those reasons, the 6.5 Creedmoor has developed a really good reputation and has seen a great deal of success in the hands of competition shooters. Plus, the cartridge has also successfully made the jump into the mainstream hunting community. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the 22 Creedmoor. Just like the name says, the 22 Creedmoor is nothing more than a 6.5 Creedmoor neck down to shoot 22 caliber bullets. Listen to episode 351 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where I interview Derek Ratliff to learn a more detailed origin story of the 22 Creedmoor. Now, interestingly, the 22 Creedmoor is the only one of the cartridges bearing the Creedmoor name, right now anyway, that was designed and used from the start primarily for hunting. Now, all of the Creedmoor cartridges can be used for hunting. All are used for hunting. All can be and all are used for competition, but the 22 Creedmoor definitely leaned more into the hunting side of things than the others from the very beginning. Now, like I just mentioned, and as I have stated on the show ad nauseum in the past, the 6.5 Creedmoor was designed for long-range precision shooting in matches like at Camp Perry. The 6mm Creedmoor was designed by John Snow from Outdoor Life as something of a novelty project. He built it as part of a project where he was writing an article about building a Wildcat cartridge capable of 1,000-yard shots with moderate recoil. It was not really built intentionally for it, but this round did end up later taking off in PRS competitions, though. We'll talk more about the 6mm Creedmoor in detail in a future episode. Now, the 25 Creedmoor really took off because it has a ballistic advantage over the 6.5 Creedmoor and meets power factor for NRL Hunter. And, oh, by the way, does all of that with a little bit less recoil than the 6.5 Creedmoor. Now, I have done an episode specifically on the 25 Creedmoor versus the 6.5 Creedmoor. Link is in the episode description to learn more about how those two cartridges compare to each other. Anyway, the 22 Creedmoor's roots go all the way back to a predator hunting contest in Texas many years ago. Now, some of those contests can have significant cash prizes that go to teams that do well. Now, without getting into all of the details here, the idea of a lot of these contests is to kill the largest amount of predators. Usually coyotes, but sometimes, bobcats, foxes, even raccoons get thrown in there on occasion. It does depend on the contest. But you want to kill the largest number of animals within a certain time frame. Often the winner is chosen by having the heaviest stringer of a certain number and or combination of animals. Sometimes it's just the team that has the most coyotes wins. There are also penalties associated with being late to weigh in. You might lose some points if you're late, or you might be completely disqualified. In any case, like I said, you want to kill the largest number of predators in the shortest amount of time. And you want to spend that time efficiently. You want to spend that time hunting. You want to miss as seldom as possible, and you want to minimize time spent looking for wounded animals. Ideally, you go into an area that looks good for coyotes, you set up, you start calling, a coyote comes in, you take a single shot, and it goes down right there. You're not educating coyotes in the area. You're not wasting time on a set where you called in a coyote and you missed, or it hung up at too long of a range and couldn't get it to come closer, didn't feel comfortable shooting, and then it left. You are also not having to spend a bunch of time retrieving a coyote that you hit either. You don't want them to run off wounded and have to spend time looking for them, and you darn sure don't want to hit one, have it run off, and completely escape. You want to kill that coyote as quickly as possible, move on to the next set, and repeat that whole process again. Well, that guy I referenced earlier, Derek Ratliff, made a less than ideal shot on a coyote during one such contest many years ago. He was using a .22-250. He hit a coyote, but like he said, shot wasn't great. The creature spun around in a circle a few times, then took off running. He said that they eventually found the coyote, but the time they spent looking for it made Derek and his partner late to weigh in. That cost them what he said was a not insignificant amount of money. And that experience really stung. That painful experience spurred him to search for another cartridge that would have dropped that coyote in its tracks, even with, like I said, less than perfect shot placement. Now, Derek likens shooting a coyote to trying to hit a moving 2-liter soda bottle turned sideways and doing so at an uncertain range. Plus, even though they're not especially large animals, coyotes are also resilient, and they are not always easy to instantly put down, especially with a marginal shot. There are a couple different ways to go about skinning that cat, or dog in this case. They all have different pros and cons. A .22-250 can shoot a light, small caliber bullet really fast. It's super flat shooting, but it doesn't do well in the wind. Now, it certainly works on dogs. It will darn sure kill them, and people have killed truckloads of coyotes with .22-250s over the years. But terminal performance sometimes leaves something to be desired. That is especially true at extended range and with a marginal shot. With this in mind, some people bump up to a larger cartridge, like a .243 Winchester or even a .25-06. Those will also work, and they can provide better terminal performance than the .22-250, but cartridges like those are not without downsides either, though. So Derek wanted something that would shoot heavy bullets at a slower, though still screaming fast velocity that would perform better in the wind, hit significantly harder downrange, and yet would also still have a flat trajectory. All of this compared to that .22-250. So he tried out a couple different potential solutions before eventually finding one that worked better than the rest. He took a 6.5 Creedmoor, necked it down to .22 cal, and then started shooting 75 grain Hornady AMAX bullets at over 3,500 feet per second. That combination turned out to be deadly on coyotes, was still very flat shooting, did great in the wind, and had mild recoil. He also discovered that combination delivered fantastic terminal performance on deer-sized game, too. So Derek and the rest of the folks at Horizon Firearms spent the better part of the next decade refining their Wildcat cartridge. They eventually partnered with Hornady for help tweaking load development, shepherding it through the SAMI standardization process, and then eventually getting it to market. Their efforts eventually bore fruit when SAMI formally standardized the cartridge in January 2024 as the .22 Creedmoor. Hornady initially introduced 2 factory loads for the .22 Creedmoor, shooting an 80-grain ELDX and an 80-grain ELD match bullet, both at an advertised velocity of 3,285 feet per second. We'll talk more about how that sort of performance shakes out in the real world in a minute. Now let's talk about cartridge sizes. Now the .22 and the 6.5 Creedmoor are very, very similar overall. Not surprising, they're closely related. Like I said, .22 Creedmoor, literally a 6.5 Creedmoor neck down to shoot .22 caliber bullets. They have the same rim and case head diameters, 0.472 inches and 0.470 inches for each dimension on both cartridges. They have the same case length, the same 30-degree shoulder. Powder capacity is virtually identical. I measured case capacity for 5 pieces of empty brass from both cartridges in the Precision Hunter line. Came up with 51 grains of water for the .22 Creed, 52.9 for the 6.5 Creed. Now, that's very similar, but also not surprising. The .22 Creedmoor does have a smaller diameter neck, and so case capacity you would expect to be a little bit smaller, and it is. Now, the usable amount of powder capacity, likely nearly identical. For what it's worth, Hornady uses similar amounts of powder with 40.8 grains of powder for the .22 Creedmoor and 41.2 grains of powder for the 6.5 Creedmoor in the specific lots of Precision Hunter ammo I happen to have on hand for both. I just pulled the bullet, dumped the powder, weighed how much was in there. Both cartridges have the same SAMI spec max pressure of 62,000 psi. Both have a SAMI spec twist rate 1 in 8 inches. Now, both cartridges are designed to use long, heavy, high BC bullets, but there is a pretty stark difference in the common bullet weights for each because they use a different bore diameter. Now, the 22 Creedmoor can use lighter varmint and legacy big game bullets, right? You could use stuff in the 50 to 60 grain range, Hornady VMAX, Nosler ballistic tip varmint, the different Barnes bullets, etc. All that stuff will work in a 22 Creedmoor, but the factory loads available for it now use heavier bullets. As far as I know, there's 5 factory loads from big companies right now. 70 grain Acubon, 0.370 BC, 85 grain RDF, 0.498 BC, both bullets from Nosler. Gunworks makes a load with an 80 grain Berger, 0.455 BC. Hornady produces a load with a 65 grain CX bullet, 0.392 BC. That's a lead-free bullet. They also make loads with that 80 grain ELDX and 80 grain ELD match bullet I just mentioned, both 0.485 BC. You can also use other bullets like 77 grain Barnes LRX, 88 grain Hornady ELDM, 90 grain ATIP, 90 grain Sierra Match King, 0.600 G1 BC for the Sierra. Now, that cartridge is capable of flinging bullets in that weight range at 31 to 3,400 feet per second. It does depend on barrel length, of course, and those are also not the only bullets you could use in the cartridge. You could also drop down to something like a 62 grain ELD VT from Hornady, for instance. You could push that bad boy even faster. Hornady lists a max hand load for the 62 grain ELD VT, 3,850 feet per second. Man, that is screaming. 95 grain Sierra Match King is the heaviest bullet I'm aware of right now that you can use in the 22 Creedmoor, 0.599 G1 BC. Now, the 6.5 Creedmoor most often uses bullets in the 120 to 147 grain range. 120, 127 grain, 130 grain copper bullets are pretty common. 140, 143, 147 grain lead core bullets are very common. 140 grains, probably most popular bullet weight overall. 156 grain Berger Elite Hunter is the heaviest bullet I am aware of for that cartridge right now, 0.679 G1 BC. Interestingly, 147 grain ELD match has a BC of 0.697. So in general, 6.5 Creedmoor fires higher BC bullets at a much slower velocity than the 22 Creedmoor. With a 24-inch long barrel, it's firing those heavier bullets at 2,600, 2,650 feet per second. 2,700 feet per second is pretty standard for a 140-ish grain bullet for it. It could push a 120 grain bullet around 2,900 feet per second. Drop down to 90, 95 grain varmint bullet, and you could get hand loads going 3,300 feet per second, maybe a little faster. Well, those upper end velocities for the 6.5 Creedmoor top out just a little bit faster than the spot where the 22 Creedmoor gets started. Factory loads for the 22 Creed are all around the 3,300 feet per second mark with an 80 grain bullet.
AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
So how do those differences in BC and velocity translate into different performance afield and at the range with each one? So good question. To answer it, we'll compare the Nosler Acubon and Hornady Precision Hunter loads for both rounds. So we have an 80 grain ELDX, 0.485 BC, 143 grain ELDX, 0.625 BC from Hornady, and a 70 grain Acubon, 0.372 BC, and a 140 grain Acubon, 0.509 BC. In my experience, that ammo for both cartridges performs close to advertised out of rifles with 24-inch long barrels, so I'll do this comparison with each load in a rifle with that barrel length. Plus, I will also compare the Precision Hunter loads for each cartridge out of rifles with 18-inch long barrels. I've tested the 6.5 Creed with that barrel length myself. I did an episode on YouTube about it. Check it out. Link is in the episode description. Derek Ratliff also did a test for the 22 Creedmoor with barrel lengths ranging from 14 up to 26 inches. I will use data from him for the 18-inch barrel 22 Creedmoor. So velocities of these load. For the 22 Creed, 70 grain Accubon going 3,400 feet per second, 80 grain ELDX at 3,089 feet per second out of an 18-inch barrel, 3,285 feet per second out of a 24-inch long barrel. 140 grain Accubon for the 6.5 Creed at 2,650 feet per second, 143 grain ELDX at 2,520 from an 18-inch long barrel, 143 grain ELDX at 2,700 feet per second from a 24-inch long barrel. In each case, the 6.5 Creedmoor uses a much heavier and higher BC bullet, but the 22 Creedmoor shoots its projectiles much faster. So how does that all shake out? The 22 Creedmoor is flat shooting with a capital F. That is especially true with those loads with the longer barrel. Trajectory for this cartridge is on par with the 22-250. It's flatter than some 22-250 loads, not quite as flat as others. Check out my episode where I compare the 22-250 to the 22 Creedmoor. Link in the episode description for more details. Either way, 22 Creedmoor, much flatter shooting than the 6.5 Creedmoor. When comparing the same bullets to each other, you got about a foot to a foot and a half less bullet drop at 500 yards than the 6.5 Creedmoor, even 2.5 to 3 inches less bullet drop at 300 yards. Even that quote-unquote slow 22 Creed out of an 18-inch long barrel has nearly 9 inches less drop at 500 yards than the fastest and flattest shooting 6.5 Creedmoor load. Now, bullet drop is more easily compensated for with a laser rangefinder and a ballistic turret and stuff like that than wind deflection, but going through all of those steps still takes time afield. So hopefully this illustrates the benefits of this round in Derek Ratliff's initial use of the 22 Creedmoor for coyotes. It is certainly a faster and simpler round to use. You just hold and shoot at longer range with it without having to dial compared to a 6.5 Creedmoor. Max point blank range of 322 yards on a 6-inch diameter target for the 22 Creed. Compare that to 274 yards for the 6.5 Creed. The round also just gets there faster too. When comparing the ELDX load from each with a 24-inch long barrel, by the time the bullet from the 6.5 Creed has made it to 430 yards, the bullet from the 22 Creed is all the way out at 500 yards. That said, the 6.5 Creedmoor does have quite a bit more kinetic energy, both at the muzzle and downrange. The gap is from 5 to 37% more at the muzzle, depending on what loads we're comparing. That increases to 11 to 56% at 300 yards and up to 80% more at 500 yards. So there is a big difference in kinetic energy for these two cartridges. In addition to that, there is a big difference in the ranges that these cartridges hit their minimum recommended impact velocities. I like to have a minimum impact velocity of 2,000 feet per second for optimum bullet performance while hunting. A faster velocity will result in a faster and more dramatic bullet mushrooming of a given bullet type. The opposite is true, and if the bullet is going too slow when it hits an animal, it won't mushroom much or at all, and you run the risk of it just penciling through the animal and not causing much damage. I'm being very conservative with a 2,000 foot per second minimum impact velocity. The ELDX does perform better than most other bullets going slower than that. I've heard things start to become erratic below about 1,800 feet per second of impact velocity with it. So like I said, I draw the line at 2,000 feet per second. Regardless of where you draw that line, if you draw it at the same place for both cartridges with the same bullets, the 22 Creedmoor will hit that threshold much farther down range than the 6.5 Creedmoor with these loads. You're looking at about 175 to 210 yards further downrange for the various Accubon and ELDX loads. That's when you're comparing apples to apples, Accubon to Accubon for each one, etc. That is a function of the 22 Creedmoor just pushing those bullets so much faster, even out of that shorter barrel. Heck, even that short-barreled 22 Creedmoor hits that threshold 80 yards farther downrange than the best-performing 6.5 Creedmoor load. The 6.5 Creedmoor is hitting that threshold, depending on the load, between 395 and 525 yards. Long-barreled 143 grain ELDX does the best here. 22 Creedmoor is hitting that threshold between 575 and 700 yards. long-barreled 80-grain ELDX does the best here. Not saying that you should be shooting game at that range with either cartridge, but that's how far downrange it'll still be at 2,000 feet per second or faster. Now, so far, the 22 Creedmoor has a significant advantage in terms of a flatter trajectory, and it reaches the bullets from that cartridge reach their minimum recommended impact velocity farther downrange. But the 6.5 Creedmoor has more kinetic energy at all ranges, and that gap in kinetic energy widens when comparing similar bullets downrange too. Things get interesting with wind deflection, and I was actually a little bit surprised by how these cartridges performed when I sat down and actually ran the numbers. Now, wind deflection is normally a big, strong suit of the 6.5 Creedmoor, and indeed, it performs great in the wind with those high BC bullets, despite the cartridge having a relatively low muzzle velocity. However, the 22 Creedmoor also has fantastic performance in the wind that is literally almost identical to corresponding 6.5 Creedmoor loads. The two Accubon loads have similar wind deflection to each other, same thing with the ELDX loads. In fact, the performance was almost shockingly similar. Now, even that quote-unquote slow 22 Creedmoor load that's going like 3,089 feet per second still also did well here. Looking at 16 to 17 inches of wind deflection for it at 500 yards, that's darn impressive, especially with such a flat trajectory like that as well. The two quote-unquote fast ELDX loads for the 22 and 6.5 Creed had 15.3 and 15.1 inches of wind deflection, respectively, at 500 yards. So that is basically identical. The Accubon loads for each cartridge did not do as well. They weren't bad, but they weren't as good. 19.7 inches for the 6.5 Creedmoor, 20.1 for the 22 Creedmoor. So still almost identical to each other for those two cartridges. So velocity and ballistic coefficient are the two big factors that play into calculating wind deflection. And normally, in all of these cartridge comparisons I do, if you have a cartridge that shoots a high BC bullet at a moderate velocity, like the 6.5 Creedmoor, it will outperform a cartridge shooting a much lower BC bullet that is going significantly faster. But that is not what we see in this comparison. Interestingly, this comparison almost identifies the break-even point for that, how much faster the bullet has to be going for things to even out with that lower BC bullet. So we'll start with the Accubon loads here. The 70-grain Accubon from the 22 Creedmoor is going 750 feet per second faster, has a .372 versus .509 BC. And like I said, wind deflection almost equal. So a 28% faster muzzle velocity essentially offsets the 37% quote-unquote better BC for the 6.5 Creedmoor here. A similar deal with the ELDX. The 22 Creed is shooting that 80-grain ELDX, 585 feet per second faster. That's 22% faster. 0.625 versus 0.485 BC. So 28% better BC here. Once again, almost identical wind deflection. Like I said, in all of the comparisons I've ever done, I've never seen it work out quite like this before. So this was very interesting. So long story short, the 22 Creedmoor is delivering a flat trajectory, essentially on par with something like a 22-250, but with the excellent wind performance of the 6.5 Creedmoor. Now let's talk about recoil. Now, the 22 Creedmoor easily comes out on top in the recoil department here. No surprise, though, it's shooting a much lighter bullet, uses less powder. Now, I think the 6.5 Creedmoor is a very shootable cartridge, but it also recoils about 60% more than the 22 Creedmoor. So yeah, 6.5 Creedmoor recoil, not bad at all. 22 Creedmoor recoil, almost non-existent. I used the 22 Creedmoor as part of my son's marksmanship training. We started out with a 22 long rifle, and when he was good with that, I moved him up to a 223, then the 22 Creedmoor, then eventually the 25 Creedmoor. He didn't flinch metaphorically or literally with the 22 Creedmoor. He didn't with the 25 either, but that gun certainly moved him around more than the 22 Creedmoor. 6.5 Creedmoor would probably work. Wouldn't say it's a bad choice for him, but that's still a big step up from the 22 Creedmoor, especially for a little guy like him. Now let's talk barrel life. On average, When you're dealing with barrels of similar quality that are used and maintained in a similar manner, the 6.5 Creedmoor will, on average, have a longer barrel life than the 22 Creedmoor. Both cartridges run at the same pressure and they use similar amounts of powder. The biggest difference here is the 22 Creedmoor has a smaller bore diameter. So for this reason, the 6.5 Creedmoor will probably have a longer barrel life. Jaden Quinlan from Hornady estimated an average of 2,000 to 3,000 rounds of barrel life for the 6.5 Creedmoor in a spreadsheet the company published online. They did not include the 22 Creedmoor in that spreadsheet. Derek told me offline that Jaden calculated an average barrel life for the 22 Creedmoor of around 1,300 rounds, going up to about 1,800 rounds. So for what it's worth, Derek confirmed he'd seen 3 different 22 Creedmoor barrels, quote-unquote, wear out. They hit that threshold at, he said, 1,300, 1,580, and 1,700 round marks. So there you have it. 1,300 to 1,800 rounds for a 22 Creedmoor, 2,000 to 3,000 for a 6.5. Now, the 22 Creed is getting up there in terms of being a barrel burner, but even that cartridge still has a substantial barrel life for someone primarily using it for hunting. What about accuracy? Now, like I mentioned earlier, both cartridges utilize those so-called modern cartridge design principles John Snow and I talked about in episode 366. Both have a long neck for adequate neck tension on long, heavy, high BC bullets. They have a steep shoulder for head spacing. They have a fat case with minimal body taper, and they have a snug freebore diameter. All of those characteristics are conducive to good accuracy. Both cartridges have all of those design principles. But I'll say the lower recoil of the 22 Creedmoor will likely translate into better practical accuracy afield, especially when you combine that with the flat shooting and great wind bucking characteristics of that round that will help you battle environmental conditions. But I think we're really splitting hairs here. The 6.5 Creedmoor is known for outstanding accuracy itself. That has been my experience shooting the cartridge. All of the rifles I've shot in both cartridges have shot exceptionally well. Quick story about the 22 Creedmoor. I took mine, which is a Horizon Venatic, out to Abilene for a sandhill crane hunt I did in late 2024. One afternoon, we had a little bit of free time after we were done hunting. We went out to the shooting range they had on the facility out there, and I was letting the guys that were on the hunt with me shoot that 22 Creedmoor. And to demonstrate the accuracy and precision of it, we were taking spent shotgun shells, and I set them up on a table at about 80 yards with the rear end of the shotgun shell facing us, the metal part facing us, and I was having the guys shoot it off of a bench. And everybody hit one of the shotgun shells out there. We hit 4 shotgun shells with 5 shots. One guy needed 2 shots to hit the shell. Everyone else hit it on the first shot. Pretty darn impressive. Now let's talk about rifle and ammo availability for each one. 6.5 Creedmoor, incredibly popular, easily one of the top 10, maybe top 5 most popular centerfire rifle cartridges in the world today. Almost every manufacturer makes ammo for it, and you can get it using almost any bullet you can think of. On the other hand, there are only 5 loads available for a 22 Creedmoor right now. You got the Hornady Match, the Hornady Precision Hunter, the Nosler Trophy Grade ammo with the Accubon bullet, Nosler Match Grade ammo with the reduced drag factor bullet, and then Gunworks makes a load using that Burger bullet I mentioned earlier. You can also get it from custom ammo manufacturers, Copper Creek, etc. But you can also get ammo from custom ammo manufacturers for the 6.5 Creedmoor too. So basically, anywhere you get 22 Creedmoor ammo, you can also get 6.5 Creedmoor ammo, plus a bunch of other stuff that you can't get in the 22 Creedmoor. There's not really any quote-unquote cheap ammo for the 22 Creedmoor. Cheapest stuff I could find was around $40 a box, and it went up to about $110 a box on Midway USA. The Gunworks ammo was extremely expensive. On the other hand, for the 6.5 Creed, you could get really cheap S&B ammo for less than $20 a box right now. You can get normal whitetail ammo for $22.50, and then there's other budget offerings like Winchester PowerPoint, Hornady whitetail, Remington Corlock that are a little bit more expensive than that Norma stuff. And then of course there's also plenty of expensive ammo for the 6.5 Creedmoor too. So long story short, on average, it is less expensive and much more widely available than the 22 Creedmoor. All right, now let's talk rifles. Situation very similar to ammunition, just way more 6.5 Creedmoor rifle availability. Once again, almost any rifle you can think of is available in the 6.5 Creedmoor. Not so much for the 22 Creedmoor. The situation is improving, but it cannot hold a candle to the 6.5. The 22 Creedmoor was initially picked up by Horizon Firearms and Fierce Firearms. Both of them offered it almost from the very beginning. Weatherby has also recently picked up the 22 Creedmoor. They offer it in their 307 rifle. Ruger also very recently started offering the 22 Creedmoor in their Ruger American Gen 2 rifle. That is the least expensive rifle you can get in 22 Creedmoor right now. It starts at a little over $500 and goes up from there. So you can get, $500, $600, $700 Ruger rifles. You can get Weatherby rifles in it for a little over $1,000, and then you can get more expensive Horizon and Fierce rifles and stuff from other companies at higher price points. I have a Horizon Venatic rifle, 24-inch long barrel in 22 Creedmoor. That's what we were using to shoot the shotgun shells I was just telling you about. I love that rifle. It's lightweight. It's easy to carry. It shoots lights out. It loves both the Precision Hunter and the match ammo from Hornady, but that is a $3,800 rifle, though. So, like I said, great selection of rifles and ammo at different price points for the 6.5 Creedmoor. Things are not nearly that advanced with the 22 Creedmoor. It's improving, but it has a long way to go to catch up to the 6.5 Creedmoor. All right, now let's talk about how both of these cartridges perform in gel and on game relative to each other. So first, I've shot both the Hornady Precision Hunter and match ammo for the 6.5 and 22 Creedmoor into gel. Check out my video that I did on the 22 Creedmoor gel test to see it in more detail. Link in the episode description. For the ELDX bullet, both made large wound cavities. There was a lot of fragmentation. Very typical performance that you're probably used to seeing from an ELDX. The 6.5 Creedmoor did make a larger, wider, and longer wound that also penetrated better in the gel. The 80 grain ELDX penetrated just over 16 inches. The 143 grain ELDX went about 21.5 inches, so quite a bit deeper. The 22 Creed did not make a small wound, but the 6.5 Creedmoor's wound was certainly, like I said, both wider and longer. Now, the 6.5 load did have quite a bit more weight retention too, but that also makes sense because it impacted going much slower. 2610 feet per second at impact was what I estimated for it versus 3194 for the 22 Creedmoor. That's 584 feet per second faster for the 22 Creedmoor. The 143 grain ELDX had about 70% weight retention versus about 47% for the 80 grain ELDX. The situation was a little bit different with the match bullets, though. The 80 grain ELD match actually made a larger wound than the 147 grain ELD match, but the 147 grain ELD match penetrated quite a bit better. That was actually the best penetrating bullet out of the four that I tested here. Now, the shape and character of both the 80 grain ELDX and the 80 grain ELDM were similar to each other. It's just that the ELD match bullet did make a bigger, wider wound, but it didn't penetrate as deep as the ELDX. Just over 13 inches of penetration for the 80 grain ELD match bullet. The 147 grain ELDM penetrated just shy of 24 inches. So that's what you had for that one. About 21.5 inches of penetration for the 143 grain ELDX, about 16 inches for the 80 grain ELDX, and just over 13 inches for the 80 grain ELD match. Now, the match bullet, like I said, the 80 grain match bullet made a wider wound than both the 147 grain ELDM and the 80 grain ELDX for the 22 Creedmoor. Both match bullets also had a longer neck and more fragmentation overall compared to the ELDX bullets. The ELDM for the 6.5 Creedmoor had a more exaggerated quote-unquote football shape than the 143 grain ELDX or either of the loads for the 22 Creedmoor. Now, the 147 grain ELDM also had a very asymmetric expansion with just a little bit of mushrooming of the lead core, and it had a chunk of the copper jacket kicked out to the side at an odd angle. So depending on how or where you measure expansion, that could range from either just under 2x to nearly 3x expansion. All of the others had more traditional looking bullets in terms of mushrooming when I pulled them out of the gel. So in general, I'd say there's a big gap in performance between these cartridges. The 22 Creedmoor bullets I've tested tend to perform more like a varmint bullet. They give very rapid, violent expansion. The wound cavities weren't very long with them either. They penetrated a lot better than varmint bullets, but they didn't penetrate as well as bigger cartridges like the 6.5 Creedmoor. And the 6.5 Creedmoor performed along the lines of other classic big game hunting cartridges. But the results do make sense if you think about it, though, considering the roots of both of these rounds. Now, I have to give my normal disclaimer anytime I talk about ballistic gel. Results in clear gel like this don't normally translate one-to-one into real-world situations on game. Bullets tend to penetrate better in clear gel, but they don't make as large of a wound cavity in clear gel like this versus a real-life animal. So results should be taken as a general trend. I'm not saying that if a bullet penetrates X number of inches in gel, it will penetrate exactly that far in real animals from every angle, regardless of what it hits all the time. I'm just saying that if a bullet demonstrates wide, shallow penetration in gel, it'll probably produce wide, shallow penetration in animals. Likewise, if bullet A penetrates better than bullet B in gel, it'll probably penetrate better than bullet B in an animal, all other things being equal. So take all that for what you will. These general trends tend to match up well with what I have experienced on game. I'll discuss that in more detail with you shortly. So which cartridge is right for you? To sum up their advantages, the 22 Creedmoor is faster, flatter shooting, does about the same as the 6.5 Creedmoor in the wind, has less recoil, but doesn't carry as much energy downrange. You can think of the 22 Creedmoor as a hopped-up 22-250. Actually, it's more akin to a 22-250 Ackley improved with a fast twist barrel that shoots heavy for caliber, high BC bullets that you can also get factory rifles and ammo for. Check out my episode on how the 22 Creedmoor outperforms the 22-250 for more details on that stuff. All right, getting back to this comparison, the 6.5 Creedmoor does well in these areas. It's not very flat shooting, not nearly as flat shooting as the 22 Creedmoor, but not terrible. But it scores high in wind deflection and recoil, but just not quite as good as the 22 Creed in the recoil department. It does have a massive advantage in terms of rifle and ammo availability, and it's also just simply more powerful. So I would hunt deer, hogs, antelope, black bear, African plains game, even elk and moose with the 6.5 Creedmoor with appropriate ammunition and at appropriate ranges. That cartridge wouldn't necessarily be my first choice for those animals, but yes, I would hunt bigger animals like elk with the 6.5 Creedmoor. I wouldn't shoot an animal at 600 or 800 yards with it. You know, like I mentioned earlier, 525 yards, that is my absolute maximum effective range with that cartridge, because that's where even that high BC ELDX crosses that 2,000 foot per second threshold I have set for myself for a minimum impact velocity. You're welcome to disagree with me on the details here. That is where I draw the line with that cartridge. I'm also going to use the right ammunition for the circumstances. For instance, that ELDX bullet is wonderful for what it is designed for. I personally think it is also the source of a lot of problems when used under the wrong conditions. This bullet is designed for use at extended range, and it performs best at slow to moderate velocity impacts. And penetration can suffer if it is going too fast when it hits an animal. For instance, I've told the story of a pronghorn hunt many times in the past where I shot a buck at about 175 to 200 yards. I'm not sure of the exact distance, but it was definitely in that range. In any case, I shot it with that ELDX bullet. That bullet had slowed down to below 2,500 feet per second. It made a massive wound through the animal's chest, exited the other side. He ran less than 30 yards after the shot, tipped over. Now, you shoot that exact animal in the exact spot with the exact bullet at 50 yards, the situation will be different. The bullet likely won't exit. It might, but it probably won't. And you're going to have quite a bit of expansion and destruction of the vitals. That's not a problem on an antelope hunt in the open country of Wyoming. That animal's probably going to die very quickly. It won't go far. It won't be hard to find either. Recovering an animal in the open country like that, where you can see it run 100 yards or more, if it goes that far, when it goes down, oftentimes, is a very different situation than shooting a deer in really thick conditions like in East Texas where I hunt. And if it, goes more than a couple yards after the shot, you really need that easy to follow blood trail to make it easier to find. Well, that shot on the pronghorn that I made at that range that exited, that he was bleeding everywhere off of it. Massive wound on the opposite side that was freely bleeding. I didn't need to blood trail him because he didn't go far and he, went down in sight. That's still the sort of performance I like to see just in general, where I get that exit wound in case I need it for tracking. I receive lots of complaints from people about the 6.5 Creedmoor. Many of them tell the same story. They shoot a deer at 50 to 75 yards, it ran off. Sometimes they find it, sometimes they don't. Poor shots undoubtedly to blame for a lot of these situations, especially the ones where they don't find the animal. But many of these people eventually find the deer after a long and difficult tracking job. And they always tell me a similar story that's along these lines. They used precision hunter ammo with that ELDX bullet because the rifle shot it really well. They made what turned out to be a good shot on a whitetail deer at close range that they were able to confirm later by actually looking at a dead deer that they hit where they were supposed to. But the deer ran off. It left either no blood or a very sparse blood trail, and they find it, maybe 100 yards away, hours later in really thick stuff after, like I said, a difficult tracking job. The bullet did the job. The animal was killed cleanly. It didn't go that far, but because the bullet rarely exits under those conditions, they don't have a good blood trail, and it just makes recovery more difficult. Now, I think that ELDX is wonderful for longer shots. For instance, I've talked on the podcast with Mark Floyd about his elk that he killed with the 6.5 Creedmoor many years ago. That's episode 172. Long story short, he was on this hunt in Wyoming, saw a nice bull elk, not a giant bull elk or anything like that, but a respectable elk that a lot of hunters would be happy to take. Got a shot opportunity on it at about 275 yards. Shot was close to broadside, hit it squarely in the left shoulder. The animal swapped ends and started walking back in the opposite direction. He reloaded, fired again at the elk while it was walking and missed. He reloaded again, got back on target. The elk had stopped. He shot it a third time and hit with shot number 3, this one right in the right shoulder, squarely in the right shoulder. He said the animal walked about 30 more yards, laid down, and died. He said one of the shots, not sure which one, because both of them ended up traversing a lot of the same real estate inside that elk's chest cavity. One of those shots hit the top of the heart and detached the elk's aorta and pulmonary artery. So that was all she wrote right there, even though with a wound like that, it does take a few seconds for the elk to realize what's going on and collapse. So neither bullet exited, but it also clearly worked. He said the vitals of that animal were just scrambled. Absolute disaster inside the chest cavity of that elk. So that situation was absolutely perfect for a 6.5 Creedmoor with a 143 grain ELDX. It was right in the sweet spot for that ideal impact velocity for the bullet. It shot well in his rifle, all the things you like to see. And it performed great on that elk. And it would have performed in a similar manner on that elk at identical shot placement, all that stuff at a longer range as well. Now, if you are in a situation where you are almost certain that you are not going to take a shot at anything past 200 yards with a 6.5 Creedmoor, I don't advise using the ELDX. There's a lot of other bullets that I think will work great. I personally really like 140 grain North Fork semi-spitzer. I used that bullet on a giant hog out here in East Texas out of a 6.5 PRC. It'll work just the same out of a 6.5 Creedmoor. It'll just be going a little bit slower out of it. Outstanding penetration with that bullet, devastating wound cavity. That's one of the biggest actually maybe the biggest hog I've ever put on a scale. He was between 250 and 300 pounds on the hoof. Big, tough animal. A hog that size is a completely different ball of wax from a deer or even a black bear. And that bullet punched through that cartilage shield of that animal, about 70-yard shooting range. So not like super close, but on the close side, within 100 yards like that. punched through that cartilage shield, just liquefied the vitals of that hog, exited the other side. He staggered after the hit, took off running, and collapsed after about 20 yards. He didn't even go out of sight. I didn't need to track him, but there was a good blood trail from that hog in the event that he would have gone a little bit farther and I would have needed to track him. That 140 grain North Fork is outstanding for use on game like that. Big hogs, black bear, elk, even moose at appropriate ranges. That's about a 200 to 300 yard bullet max, I think, though, out of a 6.5 Creedmoor. But like I said, great on big animals like that at appropriate ranges. North Fork also makes a 120 grain semi-spitzer that you can get going quite a bit faster than the 140, and it'll still give you good penetration and a good wound cavity, all of that stuff. Tyler Friel from Outdoor Life killed a grizzly bear in Alaska with his 6.5 Creedmoor. Also a shorter range in pretty thick conditions like that. 140 grain nozzle partition worked great on that bear. He got the whole thing on video. He set the camera up, started shooting, did not move the camera, and the bear did not leave the frame of the camera. So that's the 6.5 Creed. What about the 22 Creedmoor? First, I think that cartridge is absolutely perfect for predators, coyotes, foxes, and the like. That is what it was optimized and designed for. It excels in that role. It gives you all the great things you like about a 22-250, but is just more in certain areas. Wind deflection, downrange terminal performance, that sort of thing. What about bigger game? No problem. It's excellent on deer. I have killed 2 hogs, 1 white-tailed deer with my 22 Creedmoor. Now, that story I told you from the beginning of the episode, I shot that with an 80 grain ELDX from the 22 Creedmoor. That deer was at about 100 yards and change when I shot it. I shot it right behind his left shoulder. He was quartering away slightly, and he had moved his left foot forward, and I shot him right in the armpit. Once again, that bullet just wrecked the vitals, dropped instantly, bullet exited out the point of his right shoulder. I shot the 2 hogs actually on the same hunt, just within literally 1 minute of each other. I ambushed a couple of hogs at night, early in the morning before the sun came up, using a thermal scope. I had 3 hogs that were consistently hitting one of my feeders, a big one, a medium one, and a little one. When I got there, the big one and the little one were right under the feeder. The medium one was a little bit farther away out in the woods, but I could see it. Big one gave me a shot opportunity first, shot him in the head at about 30 yards. He went down instantly. When they go down instantly like that, I have found that the other animals, the other hogs, will often just kind of stand there and look at him for a minute and be like, what the heck is going on? And that'll give me an opportunity to shoot another one. Unfortunately, while I could still see that hog, that small hog that was right there with him, he ran like 10 yards and stopped after the shot and was behind some stuff that obscured my view of him, and I didn't have a clear shot. But he was there long enough standing still that if I would have had a clear shot on him, I could have shot him. But they didn't offer me that. They were there for a few seconds standing. The little one and the medium one started moving off together. I reloaded, turned around. They started to loop around behind me, and I moved a little bit and kind of met up with them on that trail, kind of right just inside the wood line behind me. And as I was aiming, the medium hog saw me, turned around, started running away. The small hog was behind him, wasn't quite sure what was going on. He didn't see me initially. He stopped, confused there for a second, and I shot him offhand at about 30 yards. I hit him in the body a little bit far back, but I still hit the lungs. Bullet exited. He ran 2 or 3 steps and then tipped over. So of all the animals I've shot with a 22 Creedmoor, actually the smallest one actually went the farthest, but even he didn't go very far. But that also left a freely bleeding wound on him, where if he would have gone farther and I would have had to track him, it wouldn't have been an issue. I got the deer and both hogs on video. I have placed that video on YouTube. Check out the link in the episode description to see it. So with all that said about the 22 Creedmoor, I think it is an outstanding hog/coyote/whitetail deer crossover round. It just checks all of those boxes really well for those animals under the conditions you're likely to hunt any and all of them under. You could actually say the 22 Creedmoor is perfect for the Texas hunter, where those are easily the 3 most popular mammals people hunt. Now, I have not hunted pronghorn with the 22 Creedmoor. I'll bet it would also be wonderful on them too. Now, what about game that is bigger than deer, hogs, pronghorn, coyote? I have not done it myself, and I'm not necessarily sure that I even would personally if I got the opportunity, but I have heard lots of credible stories from people I trust that have used the 22 Creedmoor successfully on bigger game like that. For instance, a listener named Jeff took a 22 Creedmoor to Africa on a cull hunt in 2025. He shot several dozen animals with it. First off, he said it was absolute death on springbok with that 80 grain ELDX. Animals, say 2 to maybe 500 yards away, just absolutely would upend them. Springbok are not especially large or small animals. They're a little bit smaller than a white-tailed deer or a pronghorn. But he said that combination of the 22 Creedmoor with the 80 grain ELDX would just absolutely upend them. Could not ask for better performance. Now, he also said that it worked fine on bigger game like Gemsbok, and he said that he used both the ELDX and a 77 grain Barnes LRX on a good number of Gemsbok over there at varying ranges, but these weren't like close range shots. I think he said the closest one was around 200 yards and everything was a little bit farther than that. He was hunting in Namibia in a more semi-arid part of the country where shot distances can be longer. But he said that everything he shot with the 22 Creedmoor went down. He did not lose a single animal, but he did say that especially on those bigger animals like Gemsbok, and Gemsbok are pretty large and tough animals, maybe a little bit smaller than an elk, but they're still pretty sizable animals, and they are also tough with a capital T. He said that he would get noticeably longer tracking jobs and slower kills on game like them with the 22 Creedmoor, regardless of whether it was the LRX or the ELDX bullet, when he compared it to something like a 7 PRC. Now, he says the 7 PRC, especially with, say, a 160 grain Hornady CX or something like a 168 grain Barnes LRX. He was using those LRX bullets in a hand load a couple years ago when the cartridge was new, before Barnes was making a dedicated factory load for it. But he says he's used those a lot on previous cull hunts on Gemsbok. He says that is his absolute favorite thing to use on them, and he says that the visual effects that he has seen of that combination on Gemsbok is the most impressive, and that is the fastest kills that he has gotten with any shot placement has been with that combination. He said the 22 Creedmoor worked, but it was not as impressive. It did not kill the animals as quickly as the 7 PRC or larger things like a 300 Win Mag, for instance, he's used in the past too. And he said tracking jobs were longer with the 22 Creedmoor as well. He said that the 77 grain Barnes LRX would usually exit from almost every shot angle that he was shooting these Gemsbok at, and he said the 80 grain ELDX usually would not. He said sometimes it did, especially on the smaller animals like springbok, but less likely to do so on something like a Gemsbok. Now, Zach May from Reloading Quest took a 22 Creedmoor to Africa in 2024. He also killed all manner of game with that cartridge, all using the 80 grain ELDX bullets. He killed smaller animals like Blesbok and Impala, and he also killed larger animals as well. Biggest animal he killed was actually a waterbuck. And he said that was actually the most impressive kill that he had on the entire hunt. And he actually said that was one of his favorite parts of the hunt because it involved a long stalk on this waterbuck, made a close range, high shoulder shot on it, and it just went down instantly. He said the bullet did not exit and actually went completely to pieces. He just found small pieces of lead and the jacket in the animal afterwards. But at the same time, it's hard to argue with performance like that. It shattered that near side scapula, hit ribs on the way in, shredded the vitals, and then disrupted the spinal column in the process. Animal went down, lights turned off, literally a 0-yard tracking job. Now, Gemsbok are big and tough animals. Waterbuck, on average, are even bigger than Gemsbok are. And Zach said that he has killed several elk in his life, and he says that Waterbuck bull was bigger than all of the individual elk that he has killed. So that was a big Waterbuck bull. Very impressive. So yes, you could certainly kill an elk with the 22 Creedmoor. Now, like I said, I'm not sure that I would do that myself, but the performance on the Gemsbok, the Waterbuck, etc., is certainly proof that it can be done. You do need to keep in mind that something like the 22 Creedmoor is not legal for elk hunting in places like Colorado, though. So yes, it'll definitely work on those bigger animals. I just think that is a little bit outside the ideal use case for the 22 Creedmoor. Now, moving on, both cartridges, the 22 and the 6.5 Creedmoor, are great for use up in the mountains on game like sheep and mountain goat. Both are also wonderful for use with a hunter who just needs or prefers something with less recoil, and that is a strong suit of the 6.5 Creedmoor. It is really a strong suit of the 22 Creedmoor. Both are excellent cartridges to pair with an ultra lightweight hunting rifle. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I have a Horizon Venatic rifle. I would not say it is an ultra lightweight rifle, but it is certainly a joy to carry. Very little recoil, even with that lightweight rifle with the 22 Creedmoor. Now, to that end, Wilson Combat now owns ultralight arms, and among other offerings, they produce their NULA, or New Ultralight Arms Model 20 rifle in 6.5 Creedmoor. I think that is an excellent chambering for that rifle. There's no 22 Creedmoor offerings in that rifle yet. I don't know if there ever will be, but there are not any right now. So with all of that said, I would lean towards the 6.5 Creedmoor for bigger game. Not that the 22 isn't capable of killing bigger game, for instance, but I just think the 6.5 is better when both are using appropriate bullets. Both are wonderful for deer and the like. Now, likewise, I would lean more towards the 22 Creedmoor for use on predators and varmints. It's a great crossover cartridge, better for varmints, still plenty for deer. I think it's stretching a little bit on the bigger stuff. You could use the 6.5 on varmints. I just think the 22 is better. It's at home on deer, up to elk, and it stretches a little bit down to varmints. So like I said, there's a lot of overlap right there in the middle on deer-sized game. And then each has their, what I think are their strong suits, larger and smaller than that, respectively. I'm curious to know your thoughts on this subject. Which cartridge do you prefer out of these two, the 6.5 Creedmoor or the 22 Creedmoor? Shoot me an email. Let me know. If you are listening to this episode on Spotify, answer the poll on Spotify with your preference. Now, as you may know, if you are a regular listener to the show, I am both a fan of and an investor in North Fork Bullets. Our fantastic semi-Spitzer bonded soft point is available in .264 caliber. Unfortunately, not in 22 caliber, though. But the 120 grain and 140 grain semi-Spitzer bullet is an excellent choice for those who want a hammer of a 6.5 millimeter bullet that is suitable for the whole spectrum of game at close range. I think something like the ELDX or a Nosler Accubon long range is better for use at extended range, but I personally think the North Fork semi-Spitzer bonded soft point is ideal for most of the ranges people are doing most of their hunting at anyway. If you live in the USA, you want to order some North Fork bullets for yourself, visit thebiggamehuntingblog.com/NF. That'll take you to the North Fork website. Midway USA also sells our bullets. Go to thebiggamehuntingblog.com/NF Midway. That'll take you to the North Fork section of the Midway website. Links to both are in the episode description as well. If you enjoyed this episode and you want more content along these lines, visit thebiggamehuntingblog.com/ebook. Sign up there for a free ebook on the best hunting cartridges. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.